Warning, censored, banned. Over the last 5 years or so, it seems as though big tech's grapple over free speech is getting worse and worse. Now, there's nothing inherently new about this point of view. Big tech censorship has been critiqued by all sorts of people. What hasn't been discussed so much, however, is why it happens. Why are the Silicon Valley tech firms so intolerant of views that oppose their status quo? Is it purely a case of wanting to remove views that typically fall right of center? Is the reason linked to maximizing ad revenue? Or could there be something deeper going on? Although I do dislike some of them, I don't think it's fair to say that modern tech leaders or their policies are merely a product of quote-unquote bad people. I don't think they're sitting in their basements thinking to themselves, ooh, how do we shut down more people today? Well, maybe some are, but most are too busy impersonating Russian historical figures. Frankly, the real problem I see with big tech is something many times more dangerous than just opposing conservative points of view. It's a phenomenon that has left hundreds of millions of skulls behind it, and a drastic change in our society from the 1960s onwards. The thing I am talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is utopianism. Throughout the course of this video, I'll provide a brief overview on the history of Silicon Valley utopianism, and use the banning of Donald Trump from Twitter as an example of how it is being applied today. When most young people look at the world, they find injustices, corruption, and misery. They pin the blame for these issues on the adults. They were the ones here before me, so they must be the ones who got us here. Many young people want to change the world and dispense with the old ways of doing things. They often see themselves as being morally superior to their older counterparts. The hippie movement of the 1960s amounted to something along these lines. American society and culture were very rigid. You were supposed to grow up, get a job, salute the flag, have a family, and be quote-unquote normal. Young people in the 60s thought that was bullshit. They wanted to take drugs, have psychedelic experiences, travel the world, be free of war, borders, religion, and rules. Basically, they wanted to live something out of John Lennon's Imagine. Now, I'm definitely not someone who's against change or reinventing things. A lot of things that were challenged during the 60s were challenged for the right reasons. For example, the Vietnam War was an absolute disaster, and it's a good thing that Britain stayed out of it. What was interesting, however, was that the effects of the counterculture were not just felt on university campuses, but began to extend to the business community too. Of this, no better example exists than that of Mr. Stephen Paul Jobs, co-founder of Apple Computer. Steve Jobs was an absolute product of the counterculture. He constantly listened to Joni Mitchell, the Beatles, and Bob Dylan. He was a vegan and a sort of quasi-Buddhist. But most importantly, he had a vision to change the world. You see, Steve saw the personal computer as being a true bicycle for the mind, a way to enhance man's potential and ability. Effectively, he wanted to make all of us become superhuman. And to be fair, he succeeded. However, the thing to note about Steve Jobs is that he wasn't just doing this for the money. He was far from the typical businessman. He wasn't just someone that bought a bunch of goods and sold them at a profit. Steve had a vision, a calling. He truly wanted to change the world. In many ways, he really was a utopian or an idealist. Now, one thing I'd like to make clear from the start, and I will revisit this again later, is that there's nothing wrong with being an idealist or utopian. Or at least, there's nothing wrong with it when your utopianism is being fueled into a particular craft or trade. Steve wanted to make the best possible computers, iPhones, and tablets that the world had ever seen, and more power to him. All Steve and his team did was build cool products, and those who wanted them could buy them. Simple. Where utopianism does become dangerous is when it starts to enter the world of ideas and politics. Where it starts to become scary is where you have a group of people who have an idealist worldview that they would like to impose on the rest of us, even if it's in good faith. It is for this very reason, ladies and gentlemen, that the motto of my channel is, cherish those who seek truth, but beware of those who find it. This quote by Voltaire is one that rings especially true for utopianism. The probability that the solutions you devise for something as complex as the world won't have unintended consequences are virtually zero. And the case of big tech censorship is no different. If you take a look at the Silicon Valley entrepreneurial startup culture, there's a few things which set it apart from the more conventional world of business. And that's really its grandeur. Silicon Valley is the type of place where a non-profitable, heck, even a non-revenue generating business can be worth billions of dollars. It's a place where employees get free food, a scooter, and a funny hat. It's a place where the founders aren't simply there to build a product, market it, sell it, and get on with their lives as the directors of the Pepsi Corporation might do. Instead, the founders devise these beautiful mission statements that orient their ventures towards solving society's greatest problems and making the world a better place. Companies like Facebook don't claim to be a platform where you can just keep up with your friends and see some cat videos, but rather it's a place to develop social infrastructure, to give people the power to build a global community that works for all of us. In the eyes of Mark Zuckerberg, together we can, quote, end terrorism, fight climate change, and prevent pandemics, unquote. Let's switch to Airbnb. rather than being a place to just rent a home. Airbnb's mission is to help create a world where you can belong anywhere and be a part of a true community. What about Twitter? Its mission statement isn't just, "We allow you to say stupid shit that means absolutely nothing in 280 characters. Instead, they went slightly further and made it to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information instantly, without barriers. They declared that they will always support a, quote, free and open conversation, unquote. The Silicon Valley startups are fueled by extremely creative, very high IQ dreamers who want to change the world. Now, in order to be that kind of person who just sees opportunity everywhere you look, you most likely have two traits. One, you're very forward-looking, which by definition means you spend much more time thinking about the future than you do about the past. Two, your focus is not on what's working well in a society, but rather on what needs to be rebuilt. Effectively, your entire profession is that of destroying the old and replacing it with the new. Now, whilst these traits are magnificent for making all sorts of technological advances, that doesn't mean that they're the best traits for advancing society at an ideological level. The fact that you spend all your time looking at the future as opposed to being a student of the past is great for coming up with ideas, but it means you have no context as to whether those ideas have been tried before and what the consequences were. At the end of the day, there's a reason why not everyone is creative. And that's because most things don't actually need rebuilding. There's a reason why 90% of startups fail, and that's because most ideas are bad ideas. The thing about creativity is it's an extremely high-risk strategy, and it's one thing if your failure is only going to punish you, but it's quite another if you're going to bring down society with you. Social media has unfortunately become the primary way we communicate with each other, and that means that the rules that govern it are the rules that govern the majority of our relationships and interactions. When a social media company writes its terms of service, it's dictating the rules of our interactions with our fellow humans. It has quite literally become the judge, jury, and executioner of speech. Social media companies increasingly decide what you can and can't say, what views are acceptable and not acceptable, and this is a huge concern. Yeah, sure, they're private companies, but they've become the bedrock of our communicative infrastructure, and it's not in the public interest for a group of prepubescent CEOs who live in playgrounds to decide on the rules of the game. Just because they're good at running companies or getting people to use their software doesn't mean they know how to keep society stable. Far from it. Now look, the world needs creative people who can foresee the needs of tomorrow, like connecting people, getting a taxi, or traveling. But here's where the conversation gets problematic. There is a difference between having your own personal vision of good and evil and imposing said vision on the world. Take Ray Kroc, the CEO of McDonald's. Now I'm sure he had his own set of political views, but ultimately, the guy was just trying to sell you a Big Mac. Henry Ford didn't ask you for your position on misgendering a trans person when you bought a car. Ann Summers doesn't preach to you about systemic racism when you're buying a fucking dildo. If you're so inclined, of course. The tech companies, on the other hand, do care. They will preach to you about social issues and politics, and it's not because they're necessarily trying to make a run for president or because they strictly hate conservatives. It's because they're utopian. They believe that they have found the truth that the world needs. And so just as they would with a new ride-hailing app, they're pushing their worldview down our necks. We're talking about a group of people who feel guilty about their country's history, their skin color, their wealth, and their gender. They want to relinquish their guilt and create a world which is all rainbows, joy, and sandals for everyone. Now that's great. Nothing wrong with rainbows, joy, or indeed sandals. The only problem with this is that to get your utopia, you need to be able to diagnose exactly what's wrong with the world, and then come up with exactly the right solution. So what happens if you either misdiagnose the world's problems or implement the wrong solutions? Well, I'll tell you what happens. You'll make things worse and not better. And that's exactly what's happening now, and that's exactly what will continue to happen in the future. Now, there are plenty of examples we could look at for big tech censorship, but I'd like to explore the one of Donald Trump, as I think it's probably the best example. Donald Trump has arguably been the most divisive figure in modern political history. He's loved by many and loathed by many. However, regardless of how right or wrong Trump was on any issue, it's clear that he was the arch enemy of the Silicon Valley utopians. He was brash, anti-establishment, against migration, somewhat protectionist, described Mexicans as rapists, and banned transgender people from entering the military. These are hardly the type of John Lennon one big happy family type policies. And believe me, there are plenty of things I don't like about the guy. However, the arguments I would submit to you about him are twofold. 1. Trump may have expressed his views in about as least refined a way as one could possibly do, but plenty of his more controversial views do have at least some logic to them. 2. Even if Donald Trump were proven to be the most reprehensible person in the world, that doesn't mean that he should have been silenced by Twitter. One of Trump's most controversial policies revolved around migration. Trump argued that much tougher stances needed to be taken on both legal and illegal immigration.
Build that wall. build that wall.
Now, the issue of migration is a very sticky and contentious topic, and one could argue all day and night about the right balance to strike here. However, one thing is for sure, there are plenty of sound arguments against opening the floodgates. If you look at both throughout history and right now, ethnically diverse societies are less cohesive and more prone towards destabilization. The UK is one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world, and yet if you look at some of its most diverse cities, what you find in many cases is not diversity, but segregation, where different ethnicities move into their own districts of the city. The reason for this is simple. People need an identity, a culture, and a community that they can fall back on. And who would have thought? People tend to prefer cultures that are more similar to their own. There's a reason why all the Italians living in London gang up together and bitch about the food. There's a reason why it's only about 7% of relationships in England and Wales that are interracial. Now, make no mistake, I'm not saying people shouldn't have diverse groups of friends or interracial relationships. I think those things are great. But there is a reason why they fall into the minority, and it's not a coincidence. It's because people are often more comfortable with those who are more similar to themselves, who share their traditions, their culture, and their way of life. The only point I'm trying to make with this speech is that there are plenty of arguments in favor of migration, and there are plenty of arguments against it. Just because Trump often expressed his views like a complete buffoon, that doesn't mean that his stances should be banished from the face of the earth. Just because Silicon Valley can benefit more from migration in order to attract the most talented people, that doesn't mean that other areas of the US will benefit just as much. Each side is entitled to their view. What doesn't help, however, is if one side takes the view that the other are inbred moronic racists, and that they should be silenced. Besides, if you silence 50% of your population, they're not just going to agree with you, they're going to come back with resentment and anger. Just because a view isn't pretty, doesn't make it wrong. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, even if Mr. Trump were the most reprehensible human being in the world, it is not for the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs to decide when to silence him, especially when you consider the fact that he was democratically elected. America has its own laws on the limits to free speech, which have been made by Congress, and which are interpreted by appointed judges. If anyone is to decide on who gets to speak and when, it's them, not the entrepreneurs. The biggest danger I see with this is that just because you're highly intelligent and successful doesn't mean that you're right. And more importantly, it doesn't mean that you decide who has free speech and who doesn't. Big tech censorship is not only wrong, but it's also dangerous. And if anything is going to fuel right-wing extremism, it's this. If you keep silencing that which you don't like, it'll grow back stronger like a cancer, until someday it takes you out. This is the danger that big tech is putting us all in.